My
questions submitted here for class on 14th. And I will be back on campus.
How's everybody doing? You guys all alive? Okay. So this evening, I will be online at 8 o'clock. I haven't sent out the Zoom meeting yet, but it's here on my list of things to do as soon as I get off with you today. So any questions that you have, bring those to that meeting. Obviously, it will be best if you have taken the time to look over the material before you get there. What I don't like review sessions to be is basically a bunch of people coming and saying what's going to be on the test. The purpose of me being there is to help you understand the things that you should already assume are going to be fair game for the test. And so I'll stay as long as you guys have questions. But as soon as it seems like questions are petering out, we'll go our separate ways, and you guys can study for the exam, and I can eat dinner and go to sleep. So hold on just a minute. Okay, that's working better now. All right. If you look on the Moodle site, you'll see that I put a review sheet up there for you. As I was making it out, I discovered that we've covered a lot of material since the last exam. So if you haven't begun studying yet, you should probably get on that. It ended up being quite a long list. And like I said, one of the nice things for me about making out a review sheet is that it helps to remind me of what it is that we've covered. So that's actually good. Now I have some idea of what is before me as I go through making out the test. Any questions about the upcoming exam on Friday?
Is it going to be like the same format as the first one?
Yep, it's going to be very similar. Let me see if I have an old exam handy that I could post. Where is exam 2 from last year? Yeah, exam 2 differed somewhat from last year in terms of the coverage, evidently. Yeah, and we had already talked about the genetic engineering National Academy of Science report by the time we got to exam 2, but there are some things that are similar. So I'll just go ahead and post a copy of exam 2 from last year, and just recognize that some of the coverage is going to be different because we're doing things in slightly different timeline this semester than last semester. But that might give you some insight into, for example, how I ask you questions about nutrient cycling, for example. Yeah, I'll post that after class is over. All right. Other questions about exam? It'll be same format as last time. Everybody meet online. I would like you to keep your cameras on and microphones unmuted during the test this time. Simply just as one method of kind of at least putting my mind at ease about academic dishonesty. But other than that, it's going to be a PDF document that you can take on your iPad. If you do not have an iPad, you can take it via hard copy. But if you do that, you need to let me know beforehand. I know for one of you that I need to do that. So just you'll come by my office and get the hard copy and pick that up. But once again, verify with me that you need that. And when you pick up the hard copy, I'll put you in the biochem library, which is a quiet space where you can sit and take the test at your leisure. So the rest of you can take it on your iPad with your Apple Pencils, and that seemed to work just fine last time. One of the things that I forgot to tell you as you're doing that, at least in my annotation program that I use, if you write a bunch of stuff and something happens, sometimes my wrist hits the iPad, the edge of the iPad in a weird way that erases everything that I've been writing. So I would advise you to annotate in small batches and then save those annotations as you go through, rather than write like a whole paragraph of something and then have it suddenly wiped from existence. I discovered this when I was grading some papers the other day. So that'll just save you some time rather than having to repeat work while taking the exam. All right. The last material that we have to cover today is to finish off the nitrogen cycle, and then we're going to talk about Joel Salatin's farm out in Virginia. So can you guys see the PowerPoint? Everybody see the PowerPoint? I can't see you. Yeah, okay, all right, good. Okay, so we talked about a series of transformations of nitrogen. We talked about nitrogen fixation, which begins with atmospheric nitrogen and ends up with ammonia. We talked about who did it. We talked about why it's difficult to do. We talked about modifications in legumes that allowed them to do it. We talked about the nature of symbioses, and in this case, a mutualistic symbiosis. Then we talked about transformations from litter fall and death, going from live organic matter to dead organic matter. Then we talked about decomposition, which is taking dead organic matter and converting it into organic nitrogen that is dissolved in the soil. We then talked about how this dissolved organic nitrogen gets converted once again into ammonium in this case. And then we talked about nitrification, which is how you go from ammonium to nitrate. And nitrate, once again, is easily absorbable by organisms. And we talked about the bacteria that do that. And then we talked about the uptake of nitrogen from the soil by the roots of plants. And then we were talking about assimilation. What are the things that help plants uptake these nutrients from the soil? So we talked about mycorrhizal fungi, these things that increase the volume of soil that plant roots have available to them. And we talked about this type of mutualism. Once again, it's a mutualism between fungi and the roots of plants, as opposed to bacteria and the roots of plants. And we were about to go to the next and last transformation of all of these, which is denitrification. This is the process of taking nitrate and converting it back to gaseous nitrogen that then gets released back into the atmosphere. And so once again, this is a process that is driven by particular types of bacteria that exist in the soil. And they basically use nitrate or nitrite as a electron acceptor in the mitochondria, the part of the cell that generates energy. In some cases, well, in most cases, organisms use oxygen to accept an electron as it bounces through this thing called the electron transport chain, which is how we generate ATP, which is what we use for energy. But in this case, these bacteria use nitrate or nitrite as an electron acceptor when oxygen is low. So this is a process that occurs in the absence of oxygen. So the rate of this depends upon the presence of oxygen. It goes, decreases in the presence of oxygen, and it increases in the presence of nitrate, and it increases in the presence of greater amounts of carbon in the organic matter that is being broken down. So the main thing that you need to know about this, though, is that it starts with nitrate, ends up with nitrogen, done by bacteria, and it does best in the presence or in the absence of oxygen, which is exactly what you usually see in soils. Soils are generally low in oxygen because you have a lot of decomposition going on in soils, and that uses up oxygen and releases carbon dioxide, which is why you don't want to be buried alive. This is one of many reasons why you don't want to be buried alive. So another way in which nitrogen gets returned back to the atmosphere is through volatilization. And this is usually due to fire. And so if you burn off your cropland, or if there's a forest fire or something like that, there's a lot of nitrogen that gets released to the atmosphere as that plant material combusts. So the volatilization basically is the process of, once again, taking the substances that are in the plant bodies, in the case of ammonia and ammonium, and essentially converting ammonium to ammonia. And this is a reversible process, but it generally goes from this side, the ammonium side, to the ammonia side, and then that gets released as a gas to the atmosphere. This requires high temperatures, which is why you usually find this happening when you have fires, either burning off crop residues or things like forest fires. So, and then of course we lose some nitrogen from the system through leaching. I discussed with you last time what leaching is. Who can remind me what leaching is? What is leaching?
Isn't it when like stuff leaves the soil?
Yeah,
there's,
so
like,
why does it leave the soil? What's pulling it out of soil?
nitrogen, right?
Nope, nitrogen is leaving, but what's pulling the nitrogen out? Somebody help Olivia out.
Is it water?
Yeah, it's water. So the polar nature of water latches onto other molecules, and then as water flows through soil, it pulls those other molecules out. But because nitrate itself is also a polar molecule, as you pull this negatively charged nitrate out, it also leaches out cations that are important for plants. So calcium and potassium also leave the soils as nitrogen is pulled out of the soil. And so when nitrogens leach out of the soil, it leaches out not only the negatively charged nitrate, but it also leaches out these positively charged ions that are crucial to plant function as well. And so leaching is the main way in which nitrate leaks out of terrestrial ecosystems. As the water flows through the soil, it eventually hits bedrock at the bottom of the soil, and then it flows laterally. And then as it flows laterally, it eventually finds a place to get out and get into stream water. And then the stream water carries that nitrogen away from the terrestrial ecosystem that it was in. And so there's this kind of one-way flow of nitrogen through ecosystems when it's lost through leaching and stream flow. So we're not going to draw just yet a nitrogen cycle for polyphase farms. I want you to see what a fully constructed nitrogen cycle looks like. So this takes the same form, I did it in the same program that that the carbon cycle was done in. But what's the first thing that strikes you about this cycle as opposed to the carbon cycle? Let's go back to the carbon cycle. All this time ago, here's the carbon cycle. Everybody see the carbon cycle? Here's the nitrogen cycle. What's the first difference that you notice?
There's way more going on.
Oh my gosh, it's super complicated, isn't it? So the thing to do is you need to find a way of kind of wrapping your head around the complexity. So what I have done on the next slide is I've tried to break things down for you. So in this last slide in the presentation, you see that I've identified what the pools are. So you've got the atmosphere, you've got plants, you've got animals, you've got microbes, you've got dead organic matter, and then you've got stuff in soil. And so then you have all these different fluxes. Remember that in the carbon cycle, you just had two fluxes really. One flux was the flux from the atmosphere to the biota, which was photosynthesis, going from carbon dioxide to glucose. And the other flux was respiration or decomposition, which was going from glucose to carbon dioxide. So in nitrogen, you have all of these different forms of nitrogen and all of these different fluxes that are associated with nitrogen. So there are all these fluxes. In nitrogen fixation, you're going from what form of nitrogen to what other form of nitrogen? In nitrogen fixation, you're going from gaseous nitrogen in the atmosphere to what form of nitrogen? Overnight, a cricket has crept into my office and I can literally hear a cricket chirping. What's the product of nitrogen fixation? Plants and animals can't use gaseous nitrogen because it's triply bonded. So we break those triple bonds apart and we attach three things to the nitrogen to get it usable to plants and animals. What are the three things we add to a nitrogen molecule? Normally not nitrogen is triple bonded to itself. We break those three bonds, that leaves three bonds available for something else. It's all the same something else in this case. Mackenzie?
Is it hydrogen?
Yep, it's hydrogen. Okay, so now we know what the starting point and the ending point is for nitrogen fixation. So this is one of the fluxes. So this is moving from what pool to what other pool? Where do we find diatomic nitrogen floating around?
The atmosphere.
We find it in the atmosphere. And where are we going to find this ammonia that is the end product of nitrogen fixation?
In plants and animals.
It's going to be found in plants because, and a specific type of plant. What type of plant? These plants that have this symbiotic relationship with bacteria in their roots.
Isn't it legumes?
Yep, so specifically it's legumes. And so this is facilitated by bacteria. But these bacteria also occur in soil, so we'll also find this in the soil pool due to these free-living bacteria in soils. It only then gets into animals when animals do what to these plants?
When they eat them.
When they eat them, okay? So this is one way of thinking about these transformations. Ask yourself, for any given transformation, what do we start with at the beginning of that transformation? What is at the end of that transformation? In that transformation, what pool does it begin in as the first thing, and what pool does it end up in as the second thing? And in the process of doing that, is there anything that we need to know about any organismal helpers that might be facilitating that transformation of nitrogen? And so now we kind of have a handle on nitrogen fixation, so that when we go back to this figure, we see that there is nitrogen in the atmosphere, and there's about how much of it is in the atmosphere. And the transformation, getting nitrogen out of the atmosphere, is through nitrogen fixation. And you see that this arrow goes down to below the soil. Remember that this big box is the soil. Animals sit on top of the soil, generally speaking. Plants sit on top of the soil, but their roots are anchored in the soil. And so this atmospheric nitrogen is going to be going through nitrogen fixation to plant roots, and that's basically in the soil. There's also some nitrogen fixation that also is done by soil bacteria, but the bulk of nitrogen fixation is done by nitrogen fixing plants. And so that's the first transformation. We could go through the same process of looking at ammonification. So ammonification, what are the beginning and ending compounds of ammonification? We could go back to where we have ammonification, which is back here. Dissolved organic nitrogen to ammonium rather. So when we look at that, it's dissolved organic nitrogen to ammonium. When we look at this figure, where does dissolved organic nitrogen occur? Well, dissolved organic nitrogen is in the water that is in the soil. And so dissolved organic nitrogen becomes NH4 through the ammonification process. And this is all facilitated by soil microbes. So it's basically going from the soil, which is the pool, and it stays in the soil. And in this case, once again, it's facilitated by bacteria. So in this case, it's a transformation, but it's a transformation that stays all within one of the pools. It doesn't move from one pool to another pool. It's a flux that happens within the soil. Same thing with decomposition. In decomposition, we go from dead organic matter to dissolved organic matter, to dissolved organic nitrogen. But once again, this is a transformation that occurs within the soil. And once again, this transformation is facilitated by bacteria and fungi. Once it's in the form of NH4 or NO3, this can all be assimilated and absorbed back by plant roots. So you have a cycle going on. The plants die, become dead organic matter. The dead organic matter becomes dissolved organic nitrogen. That then ammonifies, becomes ammonium, can become nitrified, goes from NH4 to NO3, but both of these forms are absorbable by plants again. So we have what we call intrasystem cycling here. And this intrasystem cycling allows the plants to hold on to nitrogen. If the plants don't assimilate, if the plants don't absorb this nitrogen in their plant roots, that nitrogen ultimately gets leached out, it goes into groundwater, and that groundwater eventually ends up in stream flow, and it exits the ecosystem at that point. It's out here outside of the soil, and it's not going to stay in the soil and be useful for other organisms. So it's a complicated system, but it's just complicated because there are a greater number of fluxes to keep track of. Fixation, ammonification, nitrification, denitrification. Those are the four things that involve chemical transformations: fixation, ammonification, nitrification, and denitrification. All the rest of these are nitrogen pretty much staying in the same form from one place to another. And so when you think about this figure here, ask yourself, is the form of nitrogen really changing from dead organic matter to dissolved organic nitrogen? It isn't really changing form, it's just becoming released from the cells of that organized organism that was all held together when it was alive, and now it's breaking down. It doesn't really change forms until you convert that nitrogen into ammonium, or convert that ammonium into nitrate. And so this is not a balanced nutrient cycle, and it's not balanced because there's nitrogen constantly leaching out of the system through the process of leaching into groundwater. It's also not balanced because we tend to have more nitrogen fixation going on than we have returns to the atmosphere through volatilization or denitrification. Well, no, it looks like denitrification is actually quite large. So denitrification, there's more nitrogen being returned to the atmosphere than is coming out of the atmosphere into plants. And so it's unbalanced. But one of the things that you'll see here is that there's a gigantic pool of nitrogen in the soil itself. 1,200 times 10 to the 12 grams of nitrogen per year are stored in the soil. Some of that is lost in groundwater every year. Some of that gets blown back to the atmosphere, but a small chunk of that gets blown back to the atmosphere, which indicates that soil ends up being a very, very large pool of nitrogen. So here's the size of the soil pool. And that's 10 to the 15th grams of nitrogen, as opposed to these fluxes, which are all in 10 to the 12th grams of nitrogen per year. And so there's a gigantic pool of nitrogen sitting in soil, and it's that pool of nitrogen that plants draw off of to do their thing. And then, of course, there's actually an arrow missing from this figure. What's an arrow that is missing from this figure? That I should go and correct at some point. It's an obvious one. We talked about it when we first started talking about this figure. When we were talking about nitrogen fixation. I think it was Mary who said it goes from the atmosphere to plants and animals, and then I had to correct her. What did I say?
It just goes to the plants and the animals eat the plants.
Yeah, so I don't have an arrow showing the movement of nitrogen from plants to animals. And so there is a flow of nitrogen from plants to animals as herbivores eat the plants or omnivores eat the plants. And for whatever reason, when I made this figure, I didn't include that flow. So here's the tricky thing about nutrient cycles is it's easy to get lost in the complexity, and occasionally you leave a relatively important flow out of the diagram. So let me do this. All right. What can you guys see on your screen now? Is the PowerPoint gone?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to try and share something else with you. For whatever reason, it's not wanting to do it. Oh, now can you see a Word file? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So here's last year's exam. Here is a question about nitrogen or about nutrient cycling. In this case, it's a question about the carbon cycle, but basically says below is a figure illustrating the carbon cycle. Examine this and explain why humans are responsible for a net export of carbon from ecosystems back to the atmosphere. Be sure to include a quantitative assessment of the flows of carbon and identify what flux over carbon are responsible for leading to the imbalance. So this is the math that I did last time at the end of the carbon cycle, basically explaining why we're exporting more carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere than is being fixed by plants. And so you have everything in this figure that you need to answer this question. You have the flow of carbon out of the atmosphere into plants through photosynthesis. That's 120 times 10 to the 15th grams per year. We return 60 of that back to the atmosphere through respiration by plants and animals, but we only return 55 of that back to the atmosphere through the process of decomposition because 5 of that gets stored. That 120 coming out of the atmosphere into the ecosystem, and then 60 going back to the atmosphere, 55 going back to the atmosphere, and 5 staying in the soil, that makes it a balanced equation. 120 comes out, 65 goes back, 120 goes back, and 115 goes back, and 5 gets stored in soil. So that's a balanced sort of equation. And sorry, it's not balanced. Let me clarify. Getting confused because I wasn't planning on doing this on the fly. It's easier for me when I write things down. 120 comes from the atmosphere to the ecosystem. 60 gets blown back to the atmosphere through respiration. $55 gets blown back through soil respiration. So this is respiration from plants and animals. This is soil respiration. And so in this case, 120 comes out of the atmosphere and 115 goes back to the atmosphere, which means that 5 is left over, and this is stored in soil. And so it's an unbalanced nutrient cycle. It's an unbalanced cycle because we're taking more out of the atmosphere than we're putting back into the atmosphere because some of it ends up getting stored in soil. But we take this system from an imbalanced system that is imbalanced in the direction of storing carbon in soil, and through the activities of humans, we basically blow 3.8 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon back to the atmosphere through land use change, burning forests and burning crop residues and things like this, which basically means that we're now only storing what's 5 minus 3.8. Now we're only storing 1.2 in soil because we're returning more carbon back to the atmosphere. And then we do things like burning fossil fuels, which is 5.3 that gets turned back to the atmosphere. So what's 5.3 minus 1.2? That ends up being, so now instead of storage, we actually have 4.1 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon that is exported back to the atmosphere. And that takes the system from a cycle that would normally be removing carbon from the atmosphere on a yearly basis to a system that is actually exporting more carbon back to the atmosphere than is being pulled out of the atmosphere due to photosynthesis. And so everything that you need to have to answer this question is actually in this figure, because you can quantify the normal things without humans, which are photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition and soil respiration, and storage in soil carbon. And then you have the human perturbations to the cycle, which is volatilization through fire and land use, land change, and fossil fuel consumption. And the combustion of these fossil fuels then tips us over from being a system that stores carbon to being a system that exports carbon to the atmosphere. So what I'll do is I'll ask you questions about the cycle. I would never, because it would be ridiculous, I would never ask you to recreate this figure on a test. And if I'm not going to ask you to recreate the carbon figure on the test, I'm sure as hell not going to ask you to recreate the nitrogen figure on a test. But I might give you that nitrogen figure and ask you questions about it. Does that make sense? Okay. So, and like I said, I'll post this after this old test after class. So now, what I want us to do is think about Joel Salatin's farm. So this is kind of the last thing we need to do. Joel Salatin is mentioned in the book. It's this, he's talked about a lot in the 2 chapters that I have asked you to read in preparation for thinking about nutrient cycling. What is Joel Salatin's deal? Like what's kind of his philosophy about running a farm?
Basically lets like nature and animals' natural like habits do the work for him.
Yeah, so one of his things is that he tries to keep animals as close to their natural environments as possible and lets them behave as if they would behave if they were out there as their wild progenitors are. So we talked at towards the beginning of this test material about well, I guess it was kind of in the middle. We talked about the natural progenitors, the wild progenitors of all of these domesticated plants and animals. And so he basically wants, I mean, one of the things he says in the book is he wants a cow to be a cow and wants a sheep to be a sheep, etc., and a chicken to be a chicken. And so one of the things about the way we currently grow animals is we feed them on foods that they don't normally eat. And Poland talked about this earlier in the book when he talked about the presence of bacteria and things like this at concentrated animal feeding operations. And we're going to talk about concentrated animal feeding operations later. But he did mention this back in one of the chapters that you've already read at the very end of the chapter. But Salatin wants his animals to kind of do the things that they would normally do. And in the case of cattle, that's basically eating grass. It's not eating grains, which is what we feed a lot of our cattle in concentrated animal feeding operations. So if you graze your cattle on grass, they generally get more exercise. They're taking in fewer calories, and so you get leaner meat as a result of it. And as a result of that, it's actually healthier to eat. In the same way, his chickens are out there feeding on the landscape. He has these chicken houses that are mobile. If you guys don't have Google Earth, you should probably get Google Earth on your computers or your iPads. Let's see. I'm going to share my screen once again. So this is Google Earth, and this is a Google Earth. Can you guys see Google Earth? Yeah. So this is a Google Earth image of Polyface Farm. And so these are the main farm buildings. And when you zoom in on this, you see that there are these structures, and they're in this little diagonal line. And you can see that behind these structures, to the northwest of these structures, everything is brown, and to the southeast of these structures, everything is green. These are the portable chicken coops, and as he moves these chicken coops around, I'm going to see if you can actually zoom in on them. You can see that there's a coop, and then there's a little run. And when this coop was sitting on this land right behind it, these chickens basically ate everything that was in there. That's why it's all brown. And as you move further and further back, these areas have greened up because they have recovered from being foraged on by these chickens. And so let's zoom out again. So this picture, this aerial photo was taken in October of 2017. If you're on Google Earth on your computer, you can click this little time. It looks like a little clock face with an arrow on it, and you can get historical imagery. And so you can go back in time. And so this is September of 2015. And once again, you can see his chicken coops marching across the fields. And as they march across the field, they decimate the vegetation right where they just were. But over time, all of that vegetation slowly grows back after those chickens have passed. You can see some other chicken coops up here that are not being used at this particular time. Go back to the next earliest one. Here is, this is November. So in November in Virginia, they're in the middle of winter. And so all of his chickens are not foraging on the land because the grass isn't going to recover very well. And so all of the chicken coops are lined up here, ready to go for the next spring when they'll start marching, once again, marching across the landscape. End of October of 2013, similar situation. You've got all the coops lined up. Once again, here you have June 20th of 2011, a lower resolution image, but once again, you can still see the chicken coops making their way across the field. And even though the resolution is not very good, you can still see that there's this brown patch behind the chicken coops. And as you get further and further away from the chicken coops, it gets greener and greener. And so he does what they call rotational grazing. So now I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to mute all of you for a minute. Okay. Okay, so you guys can see my screen. So when he's, well, you can see the board. So when he's talking about this form of rotational grazing, somebody describe this for me. Now I can unmute you. Maybe I can unmute you. Just trying to get Zoom to do something. Yeah, okay, unmute yourselves. So what is this rotational grazing like? What does he do physically?
Rotational grazing you usually do with like cattle and horses, but like so you put your animals out in the field, they do their grazing, and it'll move to a new field and it kind of lets new plant life grow and more. Like
Yeah, so that's how normal people do rotational grazing. How does Joel Salatin do rotational grazing? One way of thinking about this might be to think about what are the kinds of animals that he raises on his farm. We can start there. What kind of animals does he raise on his farm?
Chickens and rabbits.
So he raises chickens and rabbits. What else does he raise?
Turkeys.
What's that?
Turkeys.
He raises turkeys. Turkeys, though, live in the forest, not in the field. What else does he raise?
Pigs.
He raises pigs. Once again, they spend most of their time in the forest. They only come out of the forest in the springtime for a short period of time. Who else does he raise?
Cows.
Cows. So turkeys and pigs live in the forest. I'm actually not sure where the rabbits live. They must live in hutches somewhere, but I'm not sure that they're part of the rotational grazing scheme. And so cows and chickens are what Poland talks a lot about when he thinks about the rotational grazing. So in the springtime, as the grass is coming up, what does Salatin put into his fields first? What animals does he put out first?
The chickens.
He doesn't put out the chickens first. Try again, Branson.
Cows.
He puts out the cows first. So he puts out the cows. Stick figure of a cow. It's a happy cow because it's Joel Salatin cow, and he lets cows be like cows. What are these cows doing while they're there? Standing out in a field of grass, what do they do?
Eat the grass.
They eat the grass, and so they'll take this grass and they'll crop it down a certain distance. So they eat a certain amount of the grass, and before they graze it all the way down to the soil, he takes these cattle and he moves them to another part of the farm, and there's an electric fence that goes around these cattle to keep them in a place. He takes down the fence, moves the cattle from place 1 to place 2, where they have nice tall grass again, and then in that pen, they tend to eat that grass down before he moves them to another patch of grass. And rather than putting them in a whole pasture, these patches are relatively small, relatively constrained. What does he do after the cows have gone in? Well, so while this cow is in this patch, it's not only eating the grass, what else is it doing? When you eat and drink, you have to do what eventually?
Fertilizer.
Bathroom.
You have to go to the bathroom. So these guys are pooping and peeing, and they're leaving cow patties all around on the landscape. And so they are pooping and peeing as they eat. And then when the cows leave one pasture, one area of pasture, and move to another area of pasture, what happens while they're in there is what's colonizing these cow patties? What lands on a cow patty and lays eggs there? Once again, this is all in the book.
You fly.
Yeah, flies come in and they lay eggs, and in these cow patties, maggots start growing, and the maggots are consuming the cow patties, consuming the nutrients and energy that is in these cow patties. So the cow is getting carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus from the grass. It's excreting that nitrogen and phosphorus and carbon out in the form of cow patties. Then flies come in, land on the cow patties, lay their eggs on the cow patties, and then the larvae of the flies develop inside of those cow patties, transferring the nitrogen and the phosphorus and the carbon from the cow patty to the body of the fly. And at that point, once the flies have colonized the cow patties and there are larvae in those cow patties, what does Joel Salatin put into this plot where there used to be cows?
Chicken.
Chickens. It's a happy chicken because it's a Salatin chicken. And what do those chickens then proceed to do?
Eat the maggots.
They eat the maggots. They go digging through the cow patties and they feed on the maggots. I just got chickens this past year. And why do people like farm-raised chickens? Why do people like eggs from free-range chickens? They cost more if they're free-range if you buy them in the supermarket. They also cost more if you just buy them directly from a farmer. Why are they so prized?
They have like a natural diet.
They have a more natural diet. They're eating bugs. They're eating insects. Do you guys recall where chickens are indigenous to? Where did the wild progenitor of chickens come from? And what's it called for that matter? It's killing you that I'm pulling all these threads together here at the end, isn't it?
Southeast Asia.
Southeast Asia, the land of jungles. It's actually called the red jungle fowl is the ornithological name for it. It doesn't live in farms. It doesn't live in fields in nature. It lives in forests, and what it feeds on in forests is what? Corn and soybeans and other grains?
Bugs.
It feeds on bugs. So Salatin is allowing a chicken to be a chicken because he's allowing the chickens into these portions of the pasture that have been fertilized by the cattle. These cow pats have been colonized by flies, and then the chickens come in and they eat the larvae of the flies by digging through the cow patties. Now, as they're digging through the cow patties, what else are they doing in that plot of land relative to nutrient cycling? Because remember, these cow patties are full of nitrogen and phosphorus.
Are they somehow helping fertilization?
Yeah, so they're taking the nutrients that are in these localized little patches, and as they dig through them to get at the insects, they're spreading that out so that rather than it being in little localized patches, it spreads throughout this whole area. So that by the time they are done, so if you've ever watched chickens do this, and I know a guy out in Richmond who raises cows and chickens and sheep the same way. When you let the chickens into a new little patch of pasture where cows have been earlier, the first thing that they do is they go in and they eat all the clover. They'll seek out clover. And the reason that they're seeking out clover is a legume, which means it has a lot of nitrogen in the leaves of clover. So they'll go through and they'll pick over all of the clover. And then once they're done eating all of the clover, then they start going after the cow patties and digging through the cow patties to get the insects. And after they've gotten all the good food, all the really nutritious food, they'll start eating grass. And what you generally want to do is you want to get them out of the pasture before they've eaten too much grass. You want them to move them to a new section of pasture. And so what they've done is they've eaten clover, gotten nitrogen out of that. They've eaten the insects that have been feeding off of the cow patties, and they're getting nitrogen and phosphorus out of that. And as they do that, they're spreading these cow patties around so that they're making the distribution of nutrients in that patch of field more uniform. And then we move them out of that to the next patch where there were cows before, and they just kind of rotate them through the fields over time. And the reason that the pasture can recover so quickly is because the whole time that these chickens are eating, what are they also doing?
Going to the bathroom.
They're also going to the bathroom. So you have all of this nutrient input back into the soil from cows being on the landscape, then chickens being on the landscape. All that nutrient is going to then fuel the growth of grass again. As that grass grows, it grows very quickly because of all those nutrients. And then pretty soon it's time to put cows back on there, crop down the grass, then put chickens back on there to eat the bugs, and then start the whole, run the whole process over and over again. And so when we think about the way he is running his farm, he's running his farm such that the organisms themselves are to a large degree feeding themselves and to a large degree providing nutrients that then support the food that is later going to feed themselves. And so the reason that we've been thinking about nutrient cycling is we can think about nutrient cycling in the context of this particular farm. So we have cows, we have chickens, and we have grass. Grass receives energy from the sun. So if we're talking about the carbon cycle, we would want to talk about photosynthesis, and we would want to talk about the movement of carbon between these different groups. The grass sits on the soil. The cows eat the grass. The chickens eat the grass. But while the cows are eating the grass, what are they also doing? They go to the bathroom. They put cow patties down on the ground. Flies then come and colonize those cow patties, and we have the maggots, and then the maggots are actually then fed on by the chickens. The chickens are also excreting waste products that then go into the soil. Nitrogen and phosphorus from excreta from the chickens goes into the pool of nutrients that are in the soil. And all of that then gets assimilated back into the growth of new grass. And so he's created a system that is very good at keeping nutrients cycled tightly within the system. There's not a lot of leaching because the grass picks up the nutrients that are being returned to the soil by the cows and the chickens, and those nutrients are then being cycled back to the cows and chickens as he rotates them through. So he's trying to create a system that doesn't lose a lot of soil nutrition because he does this fast, intensive, rapid rotation of animals through his land. Now, these aren't the only organisms that he has on his farm. What does he do with the pigs? This is in the chapter on practicing complexity. In the wintertime, what does he do with his cows?
He'll leave them in the barn, and then like over the winter, he'll like layer like wood chips with the cow patty, so it like builds up layers.
So they're in a barn. This is my cow. They poop, and a layer of feces builds up. And rather than come in and clean those feces out, he just leaves them there. He puts in a layer of wood chips and straw and things like this, and then just leaves the cattle in there. But what does he also put in that layer?
Isn't it corn?
He puts in kernels of corn. And then the cattle are now walking around on this new floor of straw and wood covered poop, and they continue to poop and pee. And then there's another layer of feces, there's another layer of wood, and there's another layer of corn. And this builds up layer after layer after layer throughout the winter. And then when spring comes, he turns his cattle back onto the fields, and what does he introduce into the barns?
The pigs.
Mary is clearly the only person who's read the chapter on practicing complexity. Thank you very much. What do the pigs do when they get there?
They'll like
The only
sit.
reason I say Mary's the only one who's read is because she's the only one answering these questions. What do?
They'll like sift through it to find the corn, and
They
then they'll
do what pigs do. They root through all of that stuff, and they're looking for the corn because what has corn been doing this whole time during the winter?
fermenting.
It's been fermenting. Doesn't everybody like fermented corn? It's the source of grain alcohol. We'll talk about grain alcohol when we talk about history. So they root through this pile of poop that has been laced with kernels of corn that have been fermenting all winter. And as they're doing that, they're basically mixing up this compost, this dead organic matter that has been decomposing all winter long. Once they've rooted through there and they've dug out all the corn, he turns those pigs back out to the forest where they're going to root around in the dirt for grubs and things like that. And what does he have? He has a barn full of freshly turned over compost. What is he going to do with all that compost? What do you do with manure-based compost?
Put it on fields.
Yeah, you put it back out on your fields, and that once again adds those nutrients back onto the fields so that your grass grows faster, so that you can grow more cattle and grow more chickens, et cetera, et cetera. So that chapter on practicing complexity, it really is all about nutrient cycling. Where are those nutrients going? How do we get those nutrients back into the land so that they can fuel the growth of grass, so that that grass can fuel the growth of the animals, so those animals can then produce the nutrients that are going to go back onto the land in order to fuel the growth of more grass. And so he's looked at nutrient cycling and has designed his farm in a way that it maximizes the nutrient cycling that is naturally in a system to grow as many farm animals as you can possibly grow out of what is actually really a pretty small scale farm. So go back to those chapters that I asked you to read and look at the size of the farm, and then look at how much productivity he gets out of the farm. So on page 222 of the book, it lists how many cows they get, how many chickens they produce, how many dozens of eggs they produce, et cetera, out of what is really a pretty small farm. It's only 550 acres, but a good chunk of that is woodland. And so reread that. One of the reasons that this farm is this productive is because he is maximizing nutrient cycling systems in his farm. And that is all the time we have to cover before the exam. Needless to say, if you haven't read the chapter on practicing complexity yet, you should probably do that before Friday. Questions? All right, then I will see you this evening at 8. Look for an email from me with a Zoom invitation.